Well, hello and welcome to our last panel on the EU Green Deal and a lot of things which we heard during the day, including populism and US politics, of course, as a direct effect and this direct relationship to what we are talking about today. So before we start, just let me introduce the panel of amazing speakers. So to my left, Stientje van Veldhoven, former member of the Dutch Parliament, State Secretary and Minister of the Environment and Infrastructure, which is a nice combination, I think, and now European Director of the World Resource Institute. So welcome, Stientje. On the left to her, on the right from your side, Joan Groizard from Spain. He's the Director of the Spanish Energy Agency and has a long history of driving energy policies, including having a nice target of having 80% renewables by 2030. And he will speak about this and the European wider context in a minute. And online we have Kurt Vanderberghe. Hello, Kurt, who is, as most of you know, of course, the Director General of DG Climate and has long history inside the EU Commission, including being part of the cabinet of Ursula von der Leyen and actually the advisor on the Green Deal in this function, and with a former career in the Research and Innovation Director General, following on a private function at Ernst & Young. So welcome to the speakers. Just to set the scene, the European Green Deal, as you know, 2019 European Union announced to want to be the first climate neutral continent on this planet by 2050. And what followed, and that was backed by a broad coalition between different party segments in the center, left, center, right, and green fractions of the parliament on the member states level as well. That was followed by a whole set of strategies, policy documents, regulation, but also support package in terms of investment support across all sectors in the real economy and the financial economy. So it was a whole of the economy approach to align European way of doing, to run an economy really on all aspects on a climate neutral way by 2050. There were other components as well, but this is not the focus of today's discussion. So now we're 5 years further down the road. The Scientific Advisory Board of Climate Change published a report which says we may actually be not that far away from to reach the 2030 targets, but we need much stronger policy guidance, steering and so on to get to 2040 and 2050, which are not in place. And a second result, also the same research, was there's some sort of mixed picture on the results so far. So we have quite a success overall in Europe in the energy sector. So we're moving there quite fast, at least as long as it's compared to the commitments and the policies set out at the beginning of the Green Deal. But we're not moving at all, and I think everyone knows them from their private life. We're not moving much on the transport sector, and we're not moving at all in the building sector, which are crucial to make actually this climate neutral continent a reality. So I start with the introduction, and I would love to get the first question to you, Kurt, and we hope to hear you out of your comfort zone to say what has been a success for you so far and what is really what we need to fix, meaning being a priority for the next 5 years with new parliament and new commission coming in.
Thank you for the question, Marc, and thank you for allowing me to participate online. I would obviously have preferred to be there live with you and the other speakers in the panel. I think it's fair to say that we got quite far already with the European Green Deal. We got so far that actually we see a rising concern among our public about the cost of this clean or green transition. When we launched the European Green Deal in 2019, we were surfing on a wave of popular support and political demand for climate ambition, but we were alone in the world. The US with Donald Trump, for example, had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Today, in 2024, what we see is the reverse situation. We see rising concerns among our public about the cost and the feasibility of this transition. Often concerns that are legitimate and that we have to acknowledge and address. Also, concerns that are the result of political polarization and fueled also often by disinformation, which is increasingly rampant on social media. But we're no longer alone in the world, I should say. We actually risk being overtaken in what we thought was our competitive advantage in 2019, namely in the green and clean tech and green solutions. If you ask me, what have we achieved so far? I think we have everything in terms of climate ambition now agreed in law with the European climate law. You mentioned this. That was democratically agreed with 27 member states and the European Parliament. We have put a lot of legislation in place to get us on track to 2030. At the same time, we have continued to decouple our economic growth from emissions. In last year alone, we reduced our emissions by close to 10% in only one year. And at the same time, we see that private sector investment has tripled since 2019 in Europe. Unemployment is at historically low levels. Our trade surplus with the Eurozone was the highest in January this year since 2002. And even our manufacturing index looks a bit better than that in the US. It doesn't mean that everything is rosy and pretty, far from. We see a decline in the output of our energy intensive industry sectors. So that's a reason for concern. But rather than reverting course or slowing down, we should come up with a tailored industrial strategy to make sure that those industry sectors also get successfully through the decarbonization trajectory. And I think that is something that you will see coming up in the EU strategic agenda. So all in all, I think what I could say is that we have reached a point of no return on the path to climate neutrality. And it's actually business that is asking us now to stay the course. And staying the course is existential for the European Union, not only for ecological reasons, but maybe even more for economic, security, and social reasons. So if you ask me very briefly, what are the priorities for the next Commission? It is not to have a big discussion on climate ambition. It's really about staying the course and implementing what we have agreed, which is not a green program. It's a program of economic modernization and making our economy fit for the future. And that means implementing what we have agreed with a lot of attention to just transition. Secondly, a tailored industrial policy for those sectors that really need support to get through the decarbonization challenge. Thirdly, a much more active international outreach to ensure that there is a global level playing field in the green economy, but also that we establish win-win partnerships with the global south. And lastly, and maybe the most importantly, it's to make sure that we mobilize investment. This is really an investment agenda, which requires predictability over a long term. That's why we have already suggested a 2040 target for the European Union to reduce emissions by 90% by then. That will be a big priority for the next Commission, which I believe should be an investment Commission. But we should also not forget that we need to become much better prepared for the increasing climate risks. Also, that is a difference compared to 2019. We see now real life the growing risks from climate change. We are not prepared for this, so we will need to do a lot more to make our economy, our society more resilient and better prepared for the growing risks of climate change. So staying the course, delivering on what we have agreed and preparing the post-2030 for a transformative decade and the decade up to 2040.
No, thanks, Kurt, for that clear overview and priority setting. Stientje, may I just hand over to you? So, if it's about implementation, because the policies, at broad scale are more or less like designed, but haven't we seen that in the election and during other events that we didn't get the full public support? So, isn't that a major point? And if so, how to make sure that this economic transition and transformation program also gets public support? What's your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. As a politician, you know that you need to get the public support to be able to move on. But I think actually if you look at all the political manifestos that were the basis for the vote of Europeans in these past elections, you actually see, if you compare to the previous set of manifestos, we did a piece of research on this together with a couple of other organizations in what we call our Systems Transformation Hub, we actually see a consolidation of support for the European Green Deal, especially in the context that Kurt just mentioned of industrial competitiveness. So parties across the political spectrum actually see that this is part of what the new economy is going to be like. And if we do not want to be overtaken, if Europe wants to be economically resilient, if we want to bring the cost of living down, right, we have to, if we want to have our security, we will need to make sure that we implement those policies. And I think it is also time, maybe, that we change our own rhetoric a little bit. Saving the planet was never only about saving the planet, because the planet can do very well without us. It was always about delivering for people. And I think it's also in the way we speak about it that we need to translate it more to what it does, how does it deliver for people. And I think the adaptation agenda that Kurt also mentioned in this context is one which will be absolutely vital. Europe is heating up at twice the pace of some other regions in the world, and notably the south of Europe. So the adaptation agenda, next to the implementation of everything which has the ambitions that have been set and that are so crucial for our economic independence also as Europe, is going to be absolutely vital, I think.
Well, nice. So, Joan, if you want to build on this one, as you're so much ambitious in Spain in energy and you're one of the drivers, what can we learn from that for Europe and the wider context?
Well, thank you very much for this. And indeed, as the previous speakers were saying, I think we have basically revamped energy regulation in Europe in the last 5 years. All of it, anything from electricity and gas markets to renewables to energy efficiency, energy performance in buildings, and increased into the resilience and industrial side of things, which is important. Two, also very importantly, I think Europe has proven that it can act. Probably the millennials and Gen Zers here will recognize online memes around, is the EU concerned? Our leaders tend to have a tendency, and it makes sense, to express concern whenever concerning things happen on the international arena. But with Ukraine, we were able to go beyond we are concerned, this is very concerning, and actually impose sanctions, regulation, strategy, and actually have tangible effects. And the dependence of Europe on Russian gas today is very, very different to what it was a few years ago. So I think Europe has won not only a very robust legal system when it comes to the energy transition, but actually it's proven it can actually do things. And actually, as DG Clima was saying, the fact that there is social response to the climate agenda means that something is actually shifting. So what do we need to do next, or how do we move on from here? I think a lot of work has been done, and it's been said before, on the supply side. Now the challenge is a lot more difficult because we need to move to the demand side, and that is basically decision-making problem. We're moving away from shareholders and board members of a few companies and maybe a few councils of ministers making a few decisions, big decisions on energy supply, to literally millions of decisions on how we move around, how we heat our buildings, what decision we make when we buy, when we rent, when we do something in our day-to-days. That is extremely, extremely difficult to do. We also need to address, I think, the hearts and minds, and I think lots of us here are very comfortable with the numbers and the hardware, but we need specialists in sociology, in psychology, in politics, as we were hearing before, because as the Secretary for Brazil was saying earlier, the world is not rational. It is not enough to play with numbers. And it's very good news that corporate leaders, NGOs, even heavy industry are asking politicians to recommit to the Green Deal. I think this is something that should be a lot more visible. I appreciate companies struggle to position themselves politically. It's not an arena companies are usually comfortable in. but other people are very comfortable in the political arena. So if we see this is systemic, this is problematic for competitiveness, for well-being, companies should also have a clear role to play here. And just to finish off, the importance of very few economic sectors have this. Nobody has a crystal ball, obviously, but very few economic sectors have a plan, a commitment, a local, national, and international political plan of where we want to be in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. This is surely an opportunity for ambition to anticipate strategic and investment decisions. So, let's use this and let's make the case for ambition being equivalent to competitiveness, to the chance to anticipate, rather than some sort of problem we need to solve in the short term.
So, Stientje, you have actually the very interesting approach on the systems approach at WRI and you as person. Is that an approach how you bring in demand, supply, countryside, cities and everything? So can you just elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, indeed, because I think the 6 IPCC reports said it very clearly. We cannot just focus on the supply. We will also need to focus on the demand. And even stronger, demand-side approaches could add between 40 to 70% actually of our CO2 emissions problems. But when you talk about demand-side approaches, it's not just you and me making a different choice in the same context. It is also very much about what is literally the context, the structure, the system in which we make our choices. So if we look at the transport system, for example, right, we can try to improve, make the cars cleaner. Say we make every car 50% cleaner. But still, since the population is growing, we're buying 3 times as many cars. Our emissions still go the wrong way. So we need to look at the demand side. Just improving what we have is not enough. So maybe then, can we shift to an EV? If you shift everybody to an electric vehicle, and you don't change your transport system, then we will have a massive other problem. That one of the minerals and the mining in the deep sea. So we also have to go to really avoid. How do we change the system so that you can bring your kids to school by bike, and you don't have to have that second car to actually be able to bring your kids to school? Taking a systems approach is really looking back at what is the core need that we're trying to serve. Right? People have a need for transport, they have a need for food, they have a need for energy. What is the way in which we can redesign our systems to actually provide in those essential needs that people have? Very normal needs, everybody needs them, everybody wants them, and it's a purely normal question. And how do we make sure we give people accessibility to that in a way which is sustainable and also affordable? I think that is also really putting people at the center, but we need to start looking differently at the way we try to drive the next, let's say, steps in our drive, in our development towards sustainability. We will need to look more at the system level.
And your engagement level, if I understand you correctly, one of the systems, so to say, where you found everything together is our cities, right? The communities.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So part of, let's say, this context, this actually architecture, is also, do we have the right governance? Right? If you look at cities, cities are very close to people. People trust their city government often more than they actually do the national government, which for a national parliamentarian is not necessarily a nice thing to know, but it's still good to be aware of. I think cities are one of those levers which in Europe are still underutilized for making the bridge between those high-level goals, which we will need to get to, and the local reality of people, because they want to see that the policies and incentives take into account their daily lives, their daily context. And I think cities could be a lever which we could use much more than we currently do in driving that change on the ground.
Joan, do you want to come in maybe how to engage people more and communities, whatever level is necessary to make that change, because a pure top-down approach and segmental policies probably will not make it, as we've seen from the polls, right? So you need to engage better with the people. What's your take on this one?
I think the point about context is so important, because obviously we like to think we're autonomous, we have free will, yes, of course, but we are a product of our context, of our upbringing and our day-to-day. To have a deliberately provocative example, probably all of us in this room have a smartphone with a camera and so on. There was no government policy anywhere saying we should all have phones with cameras, yet the market forces made it so. So I think there is a case here for government ensuring it's convenient for individuals to make the change, government ensuring it's not perceived as risky for companies to change, but also there's a very strong case for market forces to innovate not only from a technology perspective. Technology is an enabler, but to aid decision making. So, how can companies help us? I don't know, if in lots of places it might make sense to switch to an EV and you might actually save money, or it might make sense to switch to a heat pump and you'll probably save money, but you might not have the initial investment. Why don't, for example, banks who are obviously providing money for people to buy houses, why aren't they incorporating this as part of the business model in the housing sector? So my point is, a lot of the interaction with decision making can come from the private sector itself. There's probably more levers than we can imagine just from a pure policy or pure education perspective that we can provide from the public sector.
No, so I think that the message is quite clear. We need to have broader engagement. That's not only on the country level, it's not on the EU-specific level only. We need to have more community engagement. You mentioned geopolitics. Kurt, you mentioned that as well. We need, as one of the priorities, to reach out better to the world, right? Because there's a lot of discussion on CBAM as a technical instrument, but overall on the role of Europe in the world, as we are facing more and more real climate problems. So Kurt, what is your take on how to better interact with the global community, which is changing, the geopolitics is changing as we heard the whole day. So what's the new role of EU in the global landscape?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mark. I think the role of the EU in the geopolitical and geoeconomic context will need to become much more visible and much stronger. When we launched the European Green Deal in 2019, it was designed as Europe's new growth, innovation and investment strategy, because we knew then, and we know even better now, that we can't grow our economy or foster our prosperity on the basis of fossil fuels and resource wastage. Back in 2019, as I said, we felt a little bit alone in doing so. But now in 2024, we see that the whole world is moving in this direction and is seeing the green growth as the agenda for growth in the future. In the US, we have the IRA. China is now investing more in renewable energy than the rest of the world combined, and has, since many years, we discovered now, a strategy of shifting its growth from real estate and construction to conquering the export markets of the future, which are in clean tech. And even Africa has turned the page at its Nairobi summit last September and said that it wants to be and will be the continent of solutions for the green transition. So it seems that the whole world is moving towards net zero. There's a global race basically for this, which is good. And it shows that when this agenda of decarbonization and climate action becomes an economic agenda, rather than a purely ecological one, things can move very, very quickly for the better. But it throws up other challenges, of course. And what we now need to do differently from 5 years ago is to make sure that we help ensure a global level playing field, that we have sufficient cooperation with the rest of the world and a degree of fair competition. Europe is not afraid of competition, but the competition has to be fair. And that's why we have introduced mechanisms like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that you mentioned, for example. We also have increased our toolbox for trade defense instruments, which we are increasingly using. But we also will need to deploy a sufficient degree of solidarity. It's finding that right balance between international cooperation, competition, and solidarity that we will need to find to foster climate action in the interest of the European Union, but also in the interest of the global community. And in doing so, what we will need to do as EU is to enter into more win-win partnerships with the Global South especially. And there I believe that the upcoming COPs in Baku on climate finance and in Belém for the new NDCs provide a really good agenda. These NDCs we would like to see as true investment plans for investing in the modernization and the leapfrogging of our economic development so that we grow prosperity but stay within planetary boundaries.
So the world, no, thanks very much for that input. World looks increasingly skeptical at Europe at the moment, given all the pushbacks on Green Deals, at least in media and press and whatever, but does not reflect actually some business sentiment and citizens. But nevertheless, that's in the media. And they're looking for a strong signal on NDCs, I guess, coming up. So I think there is a need for an EU to show and signal very clearly that they are not falling behind the race to the top. Stientje, you want to say on that one, global implications of Green Deal?
Yes, I think your point on the fact that the world will be looking towards the EU for a very clear signal on a high NDC is absolutely right. I'm very much aligned with Koert, I'm not going to repeat all of that it will really be very geopolitical strategic interest for Europe to make sure that we enter into those mutually interesting partnerships with countries across the world as they are developing for their own populations the ability to foresee in those basic needs that we were just discussing for Europe, also for their population. Because just as neither of us would eat uncooked rice because using gas is bad for the environment, neither will somebody in Kenya eat uncooked rice because charcoal is bad for the environment, right? They will need to be able to foresee in their primary needs in a sustainable way, or they will have to do it in an unsustainable way. So we have every interest in making sure that we also help those countries develop their economies in a sustainable way. It's going to be absolutely vital. And I think next to all of the instruments Koert already mentioned, he didn't mention that there's also an important trade and supply chain mechanisms that the EU has and uses, like EUDR, deforestation-free supply chain. Because I'm not just talking about the challenge for climate, we're also very much talking about the much related challenge on nature. The Belém COP is going to be absolutely vital for that. But the way we use our supply chain regulation can really also help creating a market for production from a standing forest. And that's to the benefit of all of us. So there again, we need to look at the entire system, climate, nature and people combined. And I'm very, very glad that indeed, like Koert says, the international context is going to be a primary part of how the Green Deal is going to look over the next years.
We have a brutal timing here, which we see all the time, like 2 minutes. Joan, last words maybe on the global before we
super quick. So obviously the energy transition, Green Deal in general, alters geopolitics totally. We've had a whole day of conversations around geopolitics. A line that my minister, Minister Rivera, says, which I think is very interesting, is in the same way as fossil fuels have been a tool for war, have been the cause of wars and famine and so on, the trade of clean technologies and clean materials could be an instrument for peace if we get it right. So issues of conditionality, of tracing the supply chains properly, of entering into mutually beneficial partnerships could actually be, if we do it properly, if we don't replicate mistakes from the past, could actually be instruments for peace. And I think that's very, very interesting. Two, obviously, the energy transition allows Europe to stand on its own feet a lot more strongly than if we are sort of linked, fully hooked, constantly connected to an influx of imported fossil fuels. But that competition in clean tech, in materials, needs to be fair. And that means environmental criteria, but it also means social criteria. If we do not accept forced labor in London, in the UK, in Europe, we should not be buying, for example, products made under forced labor, which is an incredibly complex conversation to have from a commercial and a diplomatic perspective, because either you have a checkbox exercise where everyone complies and you sort of put it under the rug, or you actually identify child labor, forced labor, and then you stop trade. And that's very complex in a multipolar world, as we know. So plenty of implications, lots of work to do in the international arena as well.
Great, thanks very much. So I have a 30 seconds final statement question to you. Koert, maybe we start with you. If you would say the next 5 years, new parliament, new commission, what are the 1 or 2 things which you really want to give us as a message, as a key priority, which we need to look at for the next 5 years?
Well, my message would be, it's the economy, stupid. And there will be no economic growth and prosperity without taking care of our ecosystems, both the climate and biodiversity. And if not, it will be at our own peril.
Joan?
One, implementing, proving that actually the energy transition is an improved quality of life, so proving everyone wrong who is saying that this is bad for us. But two, finding different arguments. Even if your priority is sovereignty, nationalism, well, actually the energy transition has a role in that as well. So even if you don't care about social and environmental issues, there is also an economic or even a sovereignty argument for the Green Deal. So let's find the right ways to get the narrative across to every single group of the electorate or society.
Stientje, you have the privilege to have the last words.
Thanks so much. I think two words. Social cohesion is going to be absolutely vital if we want to maintain this agenda and drive it forward. And the second is system change. We really need to look beyond the improve, beyond the shift, to also the avoid. And if we want to start avoiding some problems, it means we have to look at the system change.
No, thanks very much for the panelists. I think it was a very nice wrap-up also of a complex thing. We could only scratch the first phase, as always, but I hope it gave you some input for further discussions. And I hand over back to... Are you coming? Right. Because we have a final, very nice Zoom-inning last thing for the conference. Thanks very much.
Do you want to say here for that?